Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply waiting when everyone else has given up. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to find someone who sees your worth when the world only sees your flaws. The wedding feast was supposed to end hours ago, but Einar the Stonebacked still sits alone, watching the door. His promised bride never came. Everyone whispers she fled rather than marry a scarred giant. But when Svala finally stumbles through that door at dawn, exhausted, mud-stained, torn from crossing a dangerous landslide, he doesn't rage or shame her. He simply says words that change everything. What made this silent warrior wait through the longest night of his life for a woman he'd never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, Svala Runarsdottir had stood at the edge of Dalfjord, her mother's silver brooch gleaming against her traveling cloak. The intricate metalwork caught the morning light, wolves and ravens intertwined in eternal chase, a piece her mother had worn on her own wedding day 27 winters past. Svala's fingers traced the familiar patterns, while her father, Jarl Runar, finished loading her dowry onto the pack horses. "Remember what your mother told you about marriage," her father had said, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted her cloak. "She said the heart knows wisdom the mind cannot reach," but that was before the debts, before the failed harvests and the raiders who burned their grain stores, before her father's desperate bargain with Jarl Thorson of Ironhold, his daughter's hand for military protection and gold, enough to keep their people fed. Through the winter, the journey to Ironhold should have taken 2 days along the mountain pass. Svala had traveled it twice before with trading parties, knew every stone marker and stream crossing. The path wound through pine forests that sang with wind, past meadows where wild barley grew thick and golden. On clear days, you could see the smoke from Ironhold's hearth fires rising beyond the ridge, a promise of warm halls and safety. She had ridden alone by choice, refusing her father's offer of guards. "A woman who cannot make her own way to her wedding has no business being a wife," she had declared, and meant it. Independence had always been her way, learned from watching her mother manage their household with quiet strength, from winters spent learning swordwork alongside the boys when raiders threatened their borders. Now, as dawn broke over Ironhold's timber walls, Svala understood she had been naive about many things. Independence was a luxury she could no longer afford. The great hall stood at the village's heart, its carved pillars rising like ancient trees toward a roof peaked with dragon heads. Smoke drifted from the central fire pit, carrying the scents of roasted meat and ale that had warmed the celebration through the night. But the feast was ending. Servants cleared wooden bowls and horn cups from trestle tables, while guests gathered their cloaks, speaking in low voices. At the high table, one figure remained motionless. Einar Thorson, called the Stonebacked, sat with the patience of a man carved from the mountain itself. His massive frame filled the wooden chair that would have dwarfed most men, shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of his father's haul. The nickname came from more than his size. A spear, thrust in his 19th year, had left him with a back that would never bend quite right. Though it had cost his attacker his life, the scars were visible even in the firelight. 3 pale lines across his left cheek where a Saxon blade had found its mark. A twisted ridge along his forearm from a shield that split too late. His hands, wrapped around an untouched horn of ale, bore the calluses of 20 years, holding sword and axe. Yet his eyes held something unexpected, a gentleness that belonged more to a scholar than a warrior. "She's not coming, nephew." Jarl Thorson's voice carried the weariness of a man who had waited past all reason. "No maiden rides alone through mountain passes at night. Accept what is." Einar's gaze never left the hall's great doors. "The contract stands until sunrise," he said quietly. "I will wait." The wedding horn sat untouched before him, a masterpiece of carved ivory and silver, inscribed with binding runes that would seal their union before gods and men. His grandfather had drunk from it on his wedding day, and his grandfather before him. 3 generations of Thorson brides had pledged their truth from its rim. Now it remained empty, a symbol of promises unfulfilled. Around him, kinsmen offered consolation and criticism in equal measure. Some called Svala a coward who had fled rather than honor her father's word. Others suggested wolves or bandits had claimed her on the treacherous pass. The women spoke of omens and ill fortune, of marriages that began with broken promises. Einar heard it all and said nothing. He had learned patience in war, where hasty action meant death. He had learned it in the long months of healing after battles, when bones knit slowly and scars formed their permanent maps on his skin. Most of all, he had learned it watching his own mother wait through his father's long absences, never doubting he would return. The truth was simpler than his kinsman imagined. Einar had never wanted this marriage any more than Svala likely did. At 32, he had made peace with the possibility of remaining unwed. His scars and reputation made him a useful ally, but a frightening husband prospect. When Jarl Runar had proposed the match, Einar had agreed out of duty to his father and sympathy for a desperate man. But something had changed as the night wore on. Perhaps it was the empty chair beside him, meant for a woman brave enough to travel alone through dangerous country. Perhaps it was the stories the messenger had told of Svala Runasdottir, how she had nursed sick children through the plague winter, how she had stood with sword in hand when raiders threatened her father's hall, how she had refused 3 previous marriage offers because she would not be bartered like livestock. A woman like that deserved better than a husband who would rage at her lateness or shame her before his people. If she came, when she came, she would find patience instead of anger, understanding instead of judgment. The great doors creaked open as the eastern sky turned pale gold. Every head turned, expecting servants or early-rising thralls. Instead, a figure stumbled across the threshold, cloak torn and mud-stained, dark hair escaping its braids in wild tangles. Svala Runasdottir looked nothing like the bride they had expected. Her traveling dress was soaked through and streaked with dirt. Her hands bore fresh scratches from climbing over fallen stones. One sleeve hung in tatters where thorns had caught it. She moved with the careful steps of someone who had pushed her body past endurance, yet her chin remained high and her eyes clear. The hall fell silent. Servants paused with laden trays. Guests half risen from their benches froze in place. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if the very stones held their breath. Einar rose slowly, his great height unfolding until he stood like a pillar of weathered granite. Their eyes met across the length of the hall, hers dark with exhaustion and weariness, his grey as winter sky and infinitely patient. "You are Svala Runasdottir," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. "I am." Her words came steady despite her obvious fatigue. "I apologize for my lateness." The mountain had other plans. Whispers began to ripple through the watching crowd, but Einar raised one scarred hand and silence returned. He moved around the high table with surprising grace for such a large man, never taking his eyes from hers. "The mountain can be treacherous this time of year," he agreed, as if they were discussing weather rather than a wedding that should have happened at sunset. "You chose to continue despite the danger." Something flickered in her expression, surprise, perhaps, at his calm acceptance. "I gave my word to be here. I keep my promises, even when they prove difficult." Einar stopped 3 paces away, close enough to see the determination that held her upright despite exhaustion, far enough to give her space to breathe. "As do I," he said simply. "I promise to wait." "You are not late, Svala Runasdottir. You are precisely when you are meant to be." The words hung in the air between them, like the first notes of a song neither had expected to hear. Around them, the great hall seemed to exhale, tension releasing into something warmer, more hopeful. "You're right on time for me," Einar added, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. For the first time since entering his father's hall, Svala smiled. The mountain pass had been treacherous even in daylight. By the time Svala reached the narrow ridge called Raven's Gate, the sun hung low behind storm clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Her horse, a steady mare named Astrid, picked her way carefully between loose stones that shifted underfoot with each step. Svala had made this journey twice before, But never alone and never this late in the season. The familiar landmarks, the split pine where ravens nested, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, passed by in gathering dusk. She urged Astrid forward, knowing they could reach the valley floor before full dark if they maintained their pace. That was when the mountain shrugged. The sound came first, a deep rumble that seemed to rise from the earth's bones, growing louder until it filled the world. Astrid whinnied in terror, dancing sideways as stones began to rattle loose from the cliff face above. Svala had one moment to understand what was happening before the avalanche struck. Not snow, but rock and earth, tons of it cascading down in a thunder of destruction. The path ahead simply disappeared, buried under a wall of stone 15 feet high and twice as wide. Boulders the size of houses tumbled past, some splashing into the valley stream far below with sounds like distant thunder. Astrid reared, nearly throwing Svala from the saddle. When the mare came down, her front hoof struck wrong on the shifting stones. The crack of breaking bone cut through the rumbling like a blade. The horse screamed and fell sideways, pinning Svala's left leg beneath her weight. Pain shot through Svala's knee as she struggled to free herself. Astrid thrashed weakly, eyes rolling white with agony and terror. With a broken foreleg, the faithful mare would never walk again, let alone carry a rider. There was only one mercy Svala could offer. She drew the small knife from her belt, not much of a weapon, but sharp enough for what needed doing. "Forgive me, faithful one," she whispered, stroking Astrid's neck with trembling fingers. "You carried me true. The deed was swift and clean." Astrid's suffering ended with barely a sigh, but Svala's had only begun. Alone on a blocked mountain pass with night falling and her own leg throbbing where the horse had pinned it, she faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could wait for rescue that might never come. Her father would send searchers eventually, but they would assume she had taken the main pass, not this shorter route through Raven's Gate. By the time they found the rock slide, wolves or cold would have claimed her, or she could attempt the impossible, climb over the massive pile of freshly fallen stone in darkness, trust that the path beyond remained passable, and reach Ironhold on foot. The landslide had created a wall of stone that looked like a giant's carelessly stacked playthings. Some boulders were large as houses, others small enough to grip with both hands. Between them gaped crevices that could swallow a person whole. The whole mass still shifted and settled, sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading down with sounds like whispered warnings. Any sensible person would wait for dawn at minimum. The wise choice was to build a fire, tend her injured leg, and hope the weather held until help arrived. But Svala had given her word. More than that, she had come to understand something about herself during the long ride from Dalfjord. This marriage was not just her father's political necessity, it was her chance to forge a different kind of life. To be more than Jarl Runar's daughter, more than a pawn in the endless game of alliances that kept their world from tearing itself apart. She gathered what she could carry: waterskin, traveling bread, her mother's silver brooch pinned securely inside her cloak. The rest would have to stay with poor Astrid. Svala spoke a brief prayer to Odin for wisdom and to Frigg for protection, then began to climb. The first boulder was enormous but stable, its surface rough enough to provide handholds. Svala pulled herself up slowly, favoring her injured leg. The stone felt solid beneath her weight, though she could hear smaller rocks still settling deep within the pile. Each movement sent echoes through the mass, groans and clicks that spoke of barely contained forces. Halfway up, her foot slipped on loose gravel. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangled by her fingertips over a gap that dropped into darkness. Her injured leg screamed protest as she swung it up to find purchase. Below, she could hear the stream running far beneath the fallen stones, a sound both beautiful and terrifying. The climb took hours. Sometimes she found secure paths across the tops of boulders. Sometimes she had to squeeze through narrow gaps where walls of stone pressed close on either side. Once a section gave way beneath her weight, sending her sliding backward in a shower of pebbles until her cloak caught on a jutting edge. Her hands grew raw and bleeding. Her leg throbbed with each step. The cold mountain air bit through her torn clothing, but she pressed on. Behind her, she could hear wolves beginning their evening songs, a reminder that other dangers stalked these peaks besides falling stone. The worst moment came near the top of the pile. A massive boulder balanced precariously on smaller stones, looking ready to tumble at the slightest disturbance. Svala had to crawl beneath it, feeling the weight above her like a held breath. If it shifted even slightly, she would be crushed instantly. But it held. Everything held, as if the mountain itself approved of her determination. When she finally reached the far side of the landslide, dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. The path beyond looked clear, winding down through pine forest toward the valley where Ironhold's smoke should be visible. Her legs shook with exhaustion, but she was alive and free. She had climbed over the mountain's fury through the longest night of her life. She had kept her word despite impossible odds. Most importantly, she had chosen, not the safe path of waiting for rescue, but the dangerous road of taking her fate into her own hands. The walk to Ironhold took another hour. Her injured leg made every step a small agony, but the pain felt almost welcome now. Proof that she had survived, that she had made it through. When the village's timber walls came into sight, cooking fires already sending smoke into the morning air, Svala allowed herself one moment of pure relief. She had not fled from her promised marriage. She had fought through every obstacle to reach it. Whatever came next, she would meet it as a woman who had chosen her own path, even when that path led over fallen mountains in the dead of night. The great doors of the hall stood open in the growing light. Inside, she could see a lone figure waiting at the high table, broad shoulders unmistakable even at this distance. Einar the Stonebacked had kept his own vigil through the dark hours. Svala straightened her torn cloak, touched her mother's brooch for luck, and walked through those doors to meet her destiny, a destiny she had fought to reach rather than fled to avoid. The stone that had blocked her path now rested in her travel pack, a piece of the mountain that had tested her and found her worthy. She would carry it always as a reminder that some obstacles are meant to be overcome, not avoided. The women of Ironhold descended upon Svala like concerned mothers, clucking over her torn clothes and bloodied hands. Within moments of entering the hall, she found herself whisked away to the bathing chamber, where heated stones warmed wooden tubs of water scented with pine and meadowsweet. "Poor lamb," murmured Astrid Thorson, Einar's aunt, and the closest thing to a lady of the hall since his mother's death. "Look at these scratches, and your poor hands, raw as winter bark." Svala submitted to their ministrations with weary gratitude. The warm water eased muscles she hadn't realized were knotted with tension, and the gentle attention reminded her of her own mother's care during childhood illnesses. These women understood the hardships of mountain living, the price of survival in harsh country. "The dress we prepared for your wedding is ruined." "Of course," Astrid continued, examining Svala's travel-stained garments. "But we'll find something suitable. Einar won't care what you wear. That boy has patience enough for 3 men." "Boy?" Svala asked, wincing as one of the younger women cleaned a particularly deep scratch on her palm. Astrid laughed, a warm sound that filled the chamber. "He's 32 winters old, and twice the size of most men, but he's still the child I helped raise after his mother passed. Always too gentle for his own good, that one. His father despairs of it sometimes." After the bath, they dressed her in a simple gown of deep blue wool, finer than anything she owned but comfortable rather than ostentatious. Someone had cleaned and mended her mother's cloak, though the tears in the fabric would always show where mountain thorns had claimed their price. The silver brooch caught the light as she pinned it at her throat, a small piece of home in this unfamiliar place. When she emerged from the women's quarters, the great hall had transformed. The remnants of the wedding feast had been cleared away, replaced by a simple morning meal of bread, cheese, and ale. Most of the guests had departed, leaving only family and close retainers. Einar stood when she entered, rising from a chair by the central fire, where he had been examining something in his hands. The object glinted in the firelight, an axe, but unlike any weapon Svala had ever seen. The blade was perfectly balanced. The steel folded and refolded until patterns like water rippled through the metal. The handle, worn smooth by years of use, bore carved runes she couldn't read. "This was my grandfather's," he said, holding the weapon with obvious reverence. "And his grandfather's before him. The blade has never broken, though it has turned aside more spears and swords than I can count." Svala moved closer, drawn by the craftsmanship. "The metalwork is beautiful. I've never seen steel folded like that. The smith who made it learned his craft from the eastern lands, beyond the great river. He said the secret was patience, heating and folding the metal again and again, until its strength came not from hardness alone, but from flexibility." Einar's fingers traced the blade's edge with practiced care. "Sometimes I think he was teaching me more than weaponcraft." There was something in his voice, a weight of experience that spoke of more than simple battle stories. Svala studied his profile as he examined the axe, noting how the scars on his face didn't detract from his features, but rather told stories of survival and determination. "Your scars," she said quietly. "Your aunt mentioned you were called Stonebacked. I thought it was because of your size." Einar set the axe aside and turned to face her fully. In daylight, she could see that his eyes were not grey, as she had first thought, but blue, the pale blue of winter sky reflected on ice. "There was a battle 3 years past," he said simply. "Saxon raiders had taken hostages from a coastal village, children among them." He pulled aside the neck of his tunic, revealing a twisted ridge of scar tissue that ran from his left shoulder blade nearly to his spine. Their leader carried a two-handed sword, well made and sharp. When he swung it at a child too young to defend herself, I stepped between them. The blade struck here. He touched the scar gently. The force of it drove me to my knees, but the steel didn't penetrate deep enough to cripple me. And the child? Safe. All of them were. His voice carried quiet satisfaction. The Saxon leader learned that day that some things bend but do not break. Svala felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than admiration for courage. This man had literally taken a sword meant for a child, had let his own body absorb the blow rather than see innocence harmed. The scars she had first seen as marks of defeat revealed themselves as badges of heroism. "That's why they call you Stonebacked," she said, understanding dawning. "Not because you're unyielding, but because you stood firm when others might have fallen." "Stone endures," he agreed. "It weathers storms and bears weight others cannot. But it also provides foundation for those who need something solid to stand upon." They sat together by the fire, sharing the simple meal in comfortable quiet. Svala found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. The careful way he moved despite his size, the gentleness with which he handled even simple objects like bread and ale cups. His reputation as a fearsome warrior seemed at odds with the man sitting beside her, yet she was beginning to understand that both aspects were true. "May I ask why you waited?" she said finally. "Most men would have taken my absence as insult. Some would have declared the contract void." Einar considered the question while he broke bread with his scarred hands. "My mother used to tell a story," he said eventually, "about a fisherman who cast his nets in the same spot every day for 20 years, never catching more than enough to feed his family. The fisherman mocked him, said he was wasting his time in barren waters. But he kept casting his nets because he knew the fish would come when they were ready, not when he demanded it. And did they come? On the 21st year, he pulled in a catch so vast it fed the entire village through winter. When people asked him how he knew to wait so long, he said he didn't know. He simply trusted that good things come to those who don't give up too easily." Svala felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "You think I'm worth waiting for?" "I think," Einar said carefully, "that a woman brave enough to climb over a mountain in darkness to keep her word is exactly the kind of person worth waiting for. Whether that makes us suited for marriage remains to be seen." His honesty was refreshing after a lifetime of men who spoke in flowery phrases and empty promises. Here was someone who understood that marriage was more than ceremony and contract, that it required something deeper than arrangement or convenience. "I would like to find out," Svala said softly. Einar's smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger despite the scars. "So would I." The days that followed took on a rhythm Svala had not expected. She had imagined her time in Ironhold would be filled with wedding preparations and formal ceremonies, the stiff rituals of uniting two houses through political necessity. Instead, she found herself settling into the natural flow of village life, learning the patterns that governed this mountain community. Each morning brought her to the women's hall, where a massive wooden loom dominated one corner like a patient beast waiting to be fed. The frame stood taller than Svala herself, its vertical threads already strung and ready for weaving. Astrid had suggested she occupy her time with needlework, but Svala had gravitated toward the loom instead, drawn by memories of her mother teaching her the ancient patterns. "It's been empty since Einar's mother died," explained Sigrid. A woman whose grey-streaked braids spoke of decades spent managing household affairs. She was the finest weaver in 3 valleys, could make tapestries that seemed to move in firelight. Svala ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the slight indentations left by years of use. What did she weave? Stories, mostly. The great tales, gods and heroes, battles and journeys. Her last piece showed the rainbow bridge stretching from Earth to Asgard. Took her 2 years to complete, and every thread caught light like real fire. The idea took root slowly. Svala began with simple patterns, reacquainting herself with the rhythm of shuttle and heddle. But as her fingers remembered their skill, her mind wandered to larger possibilities. What story would she tell on this loom? What pattern would emerge from the tangle of her current situation? She started with 2 figures, a woman climbing over fallen stones, a man sitting in patient vigil. Simple shapes at first, but gradually gaining detail and complexity. The woman's cloak rippled with each careful thread, showing the tears that marked her journey. The man's broad shoulders spoke of strength held in careful restraint. "It's you and Einar," Astrid observed one afternoon watching Svala work. "But why are you on opposite sides of the tapestry?" Svala paused, shuttle halfway through a complex passage. She hadn't consciously planned the separation, but looking at her work with fresh eyes, she could see what Astrid meant. The climbing woman and waiting man seemed to exist in different worlds, connected only by the suggestion of a doorway between them. "I suppose I'm still deciding which side I belong on," she admitted. The afternoons belonged to different rhythms. Svala discovered that Einar kept regular hours. Mornings spent training with the younger men, afternoons devoted to the practical business of running his father's holdings. She began timing her walks around the village to intersect with his activities, curious to see how he interacted with others when he thought no one was watching. What she found surprised her. The fearsome warrior disappeared entirely when Einar worked with the village children. His massive hands, scarred from countless battles, gentle to guide small fingers around sword hilts or help steady practice shields. His voice, which could boom commands across a battlefield, dropped to patient murmurs when explaining the proper stance for drawing a bow. "Size matters less than balance," she heard him tell a boy barely tall enough to reach his elbow. "A small man with perfect technique will defeat a giant who relies on strength alone. Watch." He demonstrated with deliberate slowness, his movements precise and economical. Even without an opponent, Svala could see the deadly efficiency in his technique, each gesture flowing into the next with practiced ease. Yet when the boy attempted to copy him and stumbled, Einar simply smiled and helped him regain his footing. "Your reputation precedes you even here," Svala commented one evening as they shared the evening meal. "The children speak of you like a legendary hero." Einar looked genuinely puzzled. "They're children." "All adults seem heroic when you're that small." "I don't think that's it." She broke bread thoughtfully, considering how to explain what she had observed. "You treat them like they matter, not as future warriors or potential alliances, but as people worthy of your time and attention right now. Of course they matter. They're our future. The simple certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in Svala's chest. Here was a man who understood that strength meant protection, not domination. That leadership meant service, not privilege. The contrast with some of the men she had known, men who saw children as inconveniences or property, could not have been starker. As the days passed, she began to understand other aspects of Einar's character. He rose before dawn not to hunt or raid, but to check on the elderly members of the community. Widow Ingrid, whose arthritis made winter mornings agony, found her firewood mysteriously restocked each day. Old Bjorn, who had lost his sight to a Saxon blade years past, received regular visits that Einar claimed were about discussing strategy, but which mostly involved listening to ancient battle stories. He thinks no one notices, Astrid confided during one of their weaving sessions. But half the village would struggle to make it through winter without his quiet help. His father trained him well in the duties of leadership. Svala's tapestry grew more complex as her understanding deepened. The separated figures began to move toward each other, their worlds overlapping in subtle ways. The man's patient vigil extended into acts of service. Tiny figures, representing villagers, gathered around his protective presence. The woman's climb over obstacles transformed into a descent toward community, toward connection. But questions remained. Each evening brought pressure from both families to formalize their union with proper ceremony. Jarl Thorson spoke of political necessities and the importance of securing alliances before winter deepened. Astrid dropped gentle hints about the wisdom of not delaying marriage when two people clearly respected each other. Respect is a good foundation, she said one evening while helping Svala work a particularly intricate pattern. Love can grow from respect, but it rarely survives without it. Yet Svala found herself hesitating at the threshold of commitment. Not from fear of Einar. She had come to understand that he would treat her with kindness, regardless of whether affection developed between them. Rather, she questioned her own motives. Had she climbed over the mountain to honor a contract, or to discover whether choice might lead to something deeper than duty? The weaving revealed her internal struggle with each day's progress. Two figures drawing closer, but still separated by the thinnest line of uncertainty, the space between choosing what was expected and choosing what the heart desired. "It's beautiful work," Einar said one evening, studying the tapestry with careful attention. "But you've left something unfinished." He was right. Between the two main figures lay a gap barely visible unless one looked closely, a space that could be bridged with a single thread. "Or left as a permanent divide. Some things can't be rushed," Svala replied, echoing his earlier words about patience. "No," he agreed quietly. "But some things require a choice to move forward at all." The morning Einar invited Svala to walk the village boundaries dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the meadow grass silver. She had been in Ironhold for nearly a week, long enough to learn the rhythms of the household, but not long enough to feel truly settled. The invitation felt significant, a chance to see beyond the hall's timber walls and understand the land that might become her home. "There's something I want to show you," Einar said, as they set out along a well-worn path that wound through pine groves toward the eastern hills. "A place my grandmother brought me when I was young and full of questions about duty and choice." They walked in companionable silence, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Svala noticed how Einar moved through the landscape, not dominating it like a conqueror, but flowing with it like someone who understood its moods and seasons. He helped her over fallen logs without making her feel weak, pointed out game trails and bird signs without making her feel ignorant. "You know this land well," she observed as they paused beside a stream that chattered over smooth stones. "I was born here. Learn to walk on these paths, swim in these waters." He knelt to cup the clear stream water, testing its temperature with the back of his hand. "My mother used to say a person could only truly love what they understood." That understanding came from attention, not possession. They followed the stream uphill, where it emerged from a series of natural pools fed by springs that bubbled up from deep in the earth. But what caught Svala's attention was not the water itself, but the stone that contained it. At the largest pool's edge stood a boulder unlike any she had ever seen. Taller than a man and twice as wide, its surface was covered with carved symbols that seemed to dance in the shifting light reflected from the water. Not crude scratches, but intricate work that must have taken years to complete. A rune stone, she asked, moving closer to examine the mysterious markings. More than that. Einar's voice carried a reverence she had not heard before. This was carved by the first settlers of this valley, 3 generations before my grandfather's time. They were fleeing something, war, famine, some catastrophe lost to memory, and found this place after wandering for months. Svala traced one of the symbols with her finger. The stone felt warm despite the cool morning air, and the carving was so deep and precise that it seemed almost like writing made solid. What do they say? My grandmother could read some of it. She said it told of journeys chosen freely rather than forced by circumstance, of unions blessed by the gods because they were made from love rather than fear. Einar moved to stand beside the stone, his large frame dwarfed by its ancient presence. But the part that always fascinated her was this section here. He pointed to a complex arrangement of runes near the top of the stone, where wind and weather had polished them to a silver gleam. She said it spoke of choice itself, how the gods honored those who chose their path, even when that path was difficult, even when easier roads lay open before them. Svala felt a strange resonance in the words, as if the ancient stone carver had somehow known about her climb over the landslide, her decision to continue despite danger rather than wait for rescue. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. When my parents arranged my first betrothal, I was barely 18, and the girl was someone I had never met. I came here ready to run away, rather than submit to duty. Einar's smile held old memories, some painful and some sweet. Grandmother found me here at sunset, convinced I was about to disappear into the wilderness, like some saga hero. But you didn't run. No, she helped me understand the difference between accepting what others chose for you and making your own choices within the constraints of honor and duty. He touched the runestone gently, the way one might touch a beloved friend's shoulder. That betrothal ended when the girl chose someone else, a choice I supported because I had learned to value choice itself over mere obedience. They sat on stones beside the pool, watching the water bubble up from hidden depths. The silence felt different here, not empty but full of possibility. Svala found herself thinking about the tapestry she had been weaving, about the gap between the 2 figures that she could not bring herself to close. May I ask you something? She said finally. Anything. When you waited for me that night, through all those hours when everyone said I wasn't coming, what were you thinking? Einar considered the question while he skipped a flat stone across the pool's surface. I was thinking about this place, actually. About choice and the courage it takes to make real decisions rather than simply following the easiest path. I don't understand. You could have stayed in Dalfjord. Your father would have found another solution to his problems eventually, even if it meant greater hardship. Or you could have turned back when you reached the landslide, claimed the mountain made marriage impossible. Any reasonable person would have accepted that explanation. Svala felt heat rise in her cheeks. You think I came only out of duty? No. Einar's voice was gentle but certain. I think you came because you wanted to see what choice looked like when it was freely made. Because you were curious about what kind of man would wait without anger, what kind of marriage might grow from patience rather than demand. The observation cut closer to truth than Svala had expected. She had told herself the journey was about honor, about keeping promises and protecting her father's reputation. But sitting beside this ancient stone that spoke of freely chosen paths, she could admit that deeper motivations had driven her over that mountain. And what have you decided? Einar asked. About choice and marriage and the kind of life you want to build? Svala looked at him, really looked, taking in the patience in his pale blue eyes, the careful way he held his strength, the scars that spoke of protection rather than aggression. Here was a man who understood that true power lay in service, that real courage meant choosing what was right rather than what was easy. "I've decided," she said slowly, "that I want to know what happens when two people choose each other, not because they must, but because they want to see what they might build together." Einar's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "That sounds like the beginning of something worth choosing." As they walked back toward the village, Svala felt the last thread of uncertainty dissolve. The gap in her tapestry would be filled not with obligation or convenience, but with the golden thread of choice freely made. Behind them, the rune stone stood sentinel beside its bubbling springs, ancient witness to another choice that honored both heart and honor. The massive iron cauldron arrived 3 days later, carried by 6 men who grunted and strained under its weight. Svala watched from the hall's doorway as they maneuvered it into the cooking yard, where it would serve as the centerpiece for the wedding feast that everyone seemed to expect would happen soon. 3 generations of Thorson brides have had their wedding meals prepared in that cauldron, Astrid explained, her voice carrying the weight of tradition. "It holds enough stew to feed 200 guests and has never failed to provide abundance for those who gather in celebration." The cauldron was indeed magnificent, black iron polished to a mirror shine, its sides decorated with hammer-worked designs of intertwining vines and soaring ravens. It had been forged by master craftsmen in the southern kingdoms, a wedding gift from Einar's great-grandfather to his bride. Now it sat empty in the yard like an expectant mouth, waiting to be filled with the feast that would seal another union. But Svala found herself staring at it with growing unease, not because she feared marriage to Einar. Their conversation at the rune stone had settled that question in her heart. Rather, she was beginning to understand the weight of expectation that surrounded their eventual ceremony. The pressure from families and community to formalize what had grown between them naturally. "When do you think the ceremony should take place?" Jarl Thorson asked that evening over dinner, his question directed toward both Svala and his son, but carrying the assumption that delay was no longer reasonable. "The moon is waxing toward full," added Astrid helpfully. "The old women say that weddings celebrated under a growing moon bring prosperity and many children." Einar looked across the table at Svala, reading something in her expression that made him set down his ale cup with deliberate care. "These are questions for Svala to answer in her own time," he said mildly. "No one should be hurried into marriage, even when the match seems suitable." But Jarl Thorson was not a man easily deflected from practical concerns. "Suitable? Boy, this is more than suitable, this is necessary. Svala's father has enemies who grow bolder each day. Her presence here under the protection of our name provides security for both our houses, but only if the marriage is properly formalized." "What enemies?" Svala asked, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the hall's drafts. The Jarl exchanged a look with his son, one of those wordless conversations that spoke of shared knowledge deliberately withheld. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Jarl Thorson said carefully. "No." Svala's voice carried the authority she had learned from watching her mother manage crisis after crisis. "If there are threats against my family, I have a right to know their nature and extent." Einar leaned forward, his face grave. "There are rumors, nothing confirmed, that Harald the Bloody has marked your father's lands for expansion. He claims Runa owes him gold from a trading venture that went badly. Harald the Bloody." The name sent ice through Svala's veins. She had heard stories of the warlord who controlled the northern fjords through brutality and extortion. "My father never mentioned any dealings with Harald. Men rarely discuss their financial troubles with their daughters," Jarl Thorson said gently. "But our sources suggest the debt is real and substantial. Harald has been patient so far, only because he knows attacking Runa directly would bring retaliation from allied jarls. But if Svala were married into our house," Einar continued quietly, "attacking her father would mean attacking us as well. Harald may be vicious, but he's not stupid enough to start a war with our combined forces." The weight of understanding settled over Svala like a heavy cloak. Her father's eagerness for this marriage, his willingness to send her alone through dangerous country, it had never been about simple alliance. It was about survival, so I am not choosing a husband, she said, her voice carefully controlled. I am choosing which group of men will protect my family from which other group of men. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Einar spoke, his words chosen with obvious care. You are choosing what every person in our world must choose, how to live with honor within the constraints that exist. Whether that makes you a wife or a political ally or something else entirely remains between us to decide. That night, Svala stood in the weaving hall long after the household had retired. Her tapestry hung on the loom, nearly complete except for that crucial gap between the two main figures. By moonlight, filtering through high windows, the woven forms seemed to move, the climbing woman and patient man forever frozen at the moment before contact. She had been naive to think choice could exist separate from circumstance, that love could grow in isolation from the harsh realities of survival and politics. The beautiful ideal she had imagined, two people freely choosing each other without external pressure, was perhaps a luxury few could afford. Yet as she stood there in the silver darkness, Svala realized something important. The circumstances might be constraining, but the choice within those constraints remained real. She could marry Einar out of duty and resignation, seeing herself as a pawn in larger games. Or she could marry him as a partner in facing whatever challenges those games presented. The difference lay not in the external facts, but in how she chose to understand her own agency within them. I thought I might find you here. Einar's voice came from the doorway, pitched low so as not to startle her. I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts circling like crows. He moved to stand beside the loom, studying her work in the moonlight. It's nearly finished. Nearly. She touched the gap between the figures with one finger. I keep thinking about what it means to choose freely when freedom itself might be an illusion. My grandmother used to say that freedom was not the absence of constraints, but the presence of meaningful choices within whatever constraints exist. Einar's hand covered hers where it rested on the loom's frame. You could still refuse this marriage. I would help you find another solution to protect your family, even if it cost us both dearly. Svala turned to face him, seeing in his moonlit features the same struggle she felt, the desire to build something real and good despite circumstances that seemed designed to prevent it. And you? Could you refuse if I asked it of you? Yes, though it would break something in me I didn't know existed until you arrived. The honesty in his voice, the acknowledgement of vulnerability despite his strength, decided her. Whatever games of politics and protection swirled around them, what existed between them was real, built from patience and respect and the slow growth of genuine affection. Then let's choose, she said simply. Not because we must, but because we want to see what we can build together against whatever storms may come. When she returned to the tapestry the next morning, her fingers moved with sure purpose as she wove the final threads. The gap between the figures closed not with a single dramatic bridge, but with tiny golden threads that sparkled like captured sunlight, a connection that grew stronger with each careful stitch. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat despite the morning cold. Svala watched from her chamber window as he stumbled from his saddle and nearly collapsed before Einar's men could steady him. Whatever news he carried had driven him to ride through the night without rest. Within moments, the hall erupted into activity. Servants scurried between chambers, voices carried urgent whispers, and the sound of weapons being readied echoed from the armory. Svala dressed quickly and made her way to the great hall, where she found Einar and his father in heated discussion over a piece of parchment that bore her father's seal. "What's happened?" she asked, though the grim expressions around the table already told her the news would not be welcome. Einar looked up, his face carved from stone. "Your father is dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. Svala gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that seemed to exclude everything but Einar's pale blue eyes. How? Raiders struck Dalfjord 3 nights ago. Harald the Bloody, as we suspected. Jarl Thorson's voice carried the weight of a man delivering news he wished he could change. Your father fought to defend the hall, but they were outnumbered 5-1. The parchment crackled as Einar spread it flat on the table. Svala could see her father's familiar script, though the words seemed to swim before her eyes. He managed to get this message out before the final attack. He says, Einar's voice caught slightly. He says Harald claimed you were promised to him as part of settling the debt. That your marriage to me was theft of his property. Property. The word tasted like ash in Svala's mouth. She had known of Harald's reputation, but somehow hearing her own reduction to chattel made the evil more real, more personal. There's more. Jarl Thorson pulled out a second document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. The messenger brought this as well, the original marriage contract between our houses. Svala had never seen the full document before. Her father had shared only the basic terms when he announced the betrothal, speaking of alliance and mutual benefit in the vague language men used when discussing women's futures. But now, reading over Einar's shoulder, she discovered clauses that chilled her blood. In the event that Jarl Runar defaults on debts totaling, she read aloud, then stopped as the number registered. 300 marks of silver. That's more than our entire holding is worth. Keep reading, Einar said quietly. Though his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth, the next clause made everything clear. Should Jarl Runar fail to discharge said debts within 2 years of this contract's signing, his daughter Svala shall be surrendered to Harald Bloodaxe as compensation, with all dowry and property rights transferring to Harald's household. Svala sank into a chair as the full scope of her father's desperation became clear. The marriage to Einar had never been about alliance or politics in any normal sense. It had been a desperate attempt to protect her from a bargain he had already made, a bargain that used his own daughter as collateral. You knew, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked between Einar and his father. Both of you knew about this clause. The guilt in their faces confirmed her suspicion before either could speak. I discovered it the day before our wedding was supposed to take place, Einar admitted. I was reviewing the contract details and found the hidden clauses. That's part of why I waited that night. I was trying to decide whether to tell you or find some other way to protect you, without destroying your faith in your father. Svala felt the world shifting beneath her feet like unstable ground. Before a landslide, everything she had believed about her journey to Ironhold, about her father's motivations, about the choice she thought she was making, all of it had been built on deception. So, when I climbed over that mountain, she said slowly, when I thought I was choosing my own path, I was actually running toward the only escape my father could arrange. When I thought I was deciding between duty and choice, I was simply picking the better of 2 forms of bondage. No, Einar's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts like an axe through wood. What you did on that mountain was real. The choice you made to trust me, to build something with me, that was real too. The circumstances may have been arranged, but your actions within them were entirely your own. But Svala barely heard him. Her mind was reeling with implications, with the understanding that her entire adult life had been shaped by a transaction she had never known existed. All those years when other men offered for me and my father refused them, saying I could choose my own path when I was ready. He was just protecting his investment, making sure I stayed available for this bargain. Svala, Jarl Thorson began, but she cut him off with a gesture. And you, she said, turning to face Einar directly. You knew I was essentially stolen property. You knew that marrying me was stealing from Harald, that it would bring his wrath down on both our houses. Yet you said nothing. The pain in Einar's eyes almost made her regret the accusation, but she was too raw for mercy. Did you think I was too weak to handle the truth? Too fragile to make a real choice if I knew what it might cost? I thought you deserved the chance to know me before you learned that our marriage would mean war. Einar said simply. "I thought if you understood who I was, what kind of man I might be as your husband, you could make a choice based on more than fear. And what kind of choice is that?" Svala stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where she could see the great cauldron sitting in the yard, that symbol of celebration and tradition now seeming more like a prison than a promise. "Choose the man who deceives you to protect you, or choose the man who would claim you as payment for debt. Some choice." The silence that followed stretched tight as a bowstring. Finally, Jarl Thorson cleared his throat. "There's one more thing in your father's message," he said reluctantly. "Harald has declared his intention to come for you within the fortnight. He claims the debt passes to your father's heir, which is you, and that you must honor the original bargain or face the consequences." Svala laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Of course he has. Because a woman's only value is her ability to settle men's debts, whether through marriage or slavery. That's not how I see you," Einar said quietly. "It's never been how I see you." She turned from the window to study his face, looking for signs of the deception she now knew he was capable of. "Isn't it? You waited for me that night knowing I was essentially a stolen bride. You let me believe I was making free choices while you withheld information that would have changed everything. How is that different from any other man who sees women as property to be managed and protected rather than people capable of making their own decisions?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Einar's face went very still, and Svala saw him absorb the blow as he had once absorbed that Saxon sword, taking the pain rather than letting it strike someone more vulnerable. "Perhaps," he said finally. "It isn't different at all." The admission broke something inside Svala's chest. She had wanted him to argue, to explain, to somehow make the deception acceptable. Instead, he had given her the one thing she could not bear, complete honesty about his own failure. Without another word, she walked from the hall, leaving behind the marriage contract, the cauldron of expectations, and the man who had somehow become both her salvation and her betrayer in the same moment. For 2 days, Svala spoke to no one. She remained in the women's quarters, taking her meals alone and refusing all attempts at conversation. The weaving loom stood abandoned, her nearly completed tapestry a mockery of the partnership she had thought they were building. Outside her window, she could see the great cauldron being cleaned and polished for a wedding that now seemed impossible. On the 3rd morning, Astrid finally broke through her solitude with the simple expedient of entering her chamber without permission and sitting down in the room's only chair. "Enough," the older woman said firmly. "Rage and wounded pride are luxuries we cannot afford right now." "Luxuries?" Svala turned from the window, her voice sharp with suppressed emotion. "I've discovered that my entire life has been built on deception, that the man I thought I was choosing already owned me through debt and contract. How is acknowledging that truth a luxury?" Astrid studied her with eyes that had seen decades of political maneuvering and family crisis. "Because Harald the Bloody arrives in less than a week, and your hurt feelings won't stop him from claiming what he believes belongs to him." The blunt words cut through Svala's emotional fog like cold water. For the first time since learning about the hidden contract, she forced herself to think beyond her own sense of betrayal. "What exactly does he want?" "You, obviously, but also your father's lands, which he can claim as compensation for unpaid debts. Your marriage to Harald would make him Jarl of both territories, a significant expansion of his power." Astrid's expression grew grim. "And if you refuse, he has legal grounds to demand compensation equivalent to the debt plus damages. 300 marks of silver plus interest, which neither this household nor what remains of my father's people could pay." "Precisely. So he takes the lands anyway, but without the legitimacy that marriage would provide. Instead of a political expansion, it becomes simple conquest." Svala sank onto the bed's edge, finally grasping the full scope of the trap her father had created. "Either way, Harald wins. Marriage gives him legitimacy. Refusal gives him justification for war, unless we find a third option." Astrid leaned forward, her voice dropping to conspiratorial levels. Einar has been working on something. He won't tell his father or anyone else the details, but he's been sending messages and receiving replies for the past 2 days. Despite her anger, Svala felt a flicker of curiosity. What kind of messages? The kind that arrive with armed escorts and bear the seals of jarls from 3 different territories. Astrid's smile held grim satisfaction. Whatever he's planning, it involves calling in favors and making new alliances. A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. "Lady Svala?" came a young voice. "Jarl Einar requests your presence in the armory." Svala and Astrid exchanged glances. The armory was not typically a place for delicate conversations. "Tell him I'll come," Svala said finally. She found Einar examining weapons with the systematic attention of a man preparing for war. Spears and swords lay arranged on wooden tables, their blades catching the light from high windows. But what drew her attention was the shield he held, not his usual battle gear, but something she had never seen before. The shield was smaller than most war shields, made of finest oak, bound with silver rather than iron. Its surface bore no painted designs or battle damage, but instead was inscribed with runes similar to those on the ancient stone beside the sacred spring. The workmanship was extraordinary, clearly the product of master craftsmen working with precious materials. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Einar said without looking up from his examination. "He carried it only once on the day he claimed this valley from the previous owners. Not in battle, in single combat that decided ownership without bloodshed." "It's beautiful," Svala admitted, despite her determination to remain distant. "But why are you showing it to me?" Einar set the shield down carefully and turned to face her. The past 3 days had etched new lines around his eyes, and she could see he had slept little more than she had. "Because I'm going to offer it to your father's creditors as guarantee of an alternative arrangement." "I don't understand." "The debt contract specifies that you must be surrendered as compensation, but it doesn't specify to whom." Einar moved to a table where parchments lay scattered, messages, legal documents, sealed agreements. "I've been in communication with every jarl who has reason to oppose Harald's expansion. 7 of them have agreed to collectively guarantee your father's debt in exchange for a military alliance." Svala felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Meaning?" "Meaning the debt gets paid, but instead of going to Harald as a wife, you would be free to make your own choice about marriage and alliance." Einar's voice remained carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "The shield represents my household's commitment to honor this arrangement, even if it costs us dearly. And Harald would accept this. He'll have no choice. The combined force of 8 allied jarls would crush him if he tried to claim you by force. He'll take the silver and find some other way to expand his territory." It was, Svala realized, an elegant solution, one that addressed the legal requirements while completely undermining Harald's real objectives. But something in Einar's manner suggested complications she hadn't yet understood. "What's the price?" she asked quietly. "Men like those jarls don't guarantee debts out of kindness." Einar's smile was bitter as winter wind. "Military service. 5 years of leading their combined forces against Harald's other expansion attempts. Essentially, I become their war leader in a campaign to contain him." The implications struck her like a physical blow. 5 years away from Ironhold, away from your family, your responsibilities here, away from everything that matters to me, he agreed softly. "Including you, if you choose to remain here." Svala stared at the shield, understanding now why he had called it a guarantee, not just of the debt payment, but of his willingness to sacrifice everything to give her the choice she had been denied. "You're doing this because I accused you of seeing me as property. I'm doing this because you were right." Einar moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and determination warring in his expression. "I made decisions about your life without consulting you. I withheld information that was yours by right. I convinced myself it was protection when it was actually another form of control." "Einar, let me finish." His voice carried the weight of words that had been carefully considered. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back the choice I took away by keeping silent about the debt contract. But I can ensure that your future choices are truly your own, free from the constraints of debt or political necessity. Svala felt tears threaten for the first time since learning about her father's deception. Not tears of grief or anger, but of recognition, seeing clearly the man she had begun to love and understanding the depth of his willingness to sacrifice for her freedom. The other Jarls have agreed to this arrangement? All of them. The papers are signed and witnessed. As soon as Harald arrives, I'll present the alternative and transfer the shield as bond. Einar picked up the ancient weapon, testing its balance. You'll be free, Svala. Free to go where you choose. Marry whom you choose, or remain unmarried if that's what you prefer. And you'll spend 5 years fighting. Herald across half of Norway. A small price for knowing you have the choices you deserve. Svala reached out to touch the shield's silver rim, feeling the weight of generations in its craftsmanship. Her great-grandfather had used it to claim his territory through honorable challenge rather than bloody conquest. Now Einar would use it to purchase her freedom through honorable sacrifice. There's something you should know, she said slowly. About choices and what I've decided I want. Einar went very still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter whatever she was about to tell him. I want to choose you, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Not because of debt or contract or political necessity, but because I've seen who you are when you think no one is watching. Because you're willing to give up everything to give me freedom, even knowing I might use that freedom to walk away from you. Svala, I want to choose a partnership where we face whatever comes together. Whether it's Harald's armies or 5 years of campaign or anything else the world throws at us. She met his eyes steadily. I want to choose the man who would carry his great-grandfather's shield into exile to purchase my freedom. The shield slipped from Einar's fingers, clattering on the stone floor as he reached for her. When his arms closed around her, Svala felt something settle in her chest, not the desperate relief of escape, but the deeper satisfaction of choosing her own path towards something worth building. Outside, she could hear the sounds of preparation continuing, weapons being sharpened, supplies being gathered, messages being sent. Harald would arrive soon, expecting to claim his prize. Instead, he would find 2 people who had chosen each other freely, backed by allies who would ensure that choice was respected. The battle ahead would determine more than just Svala's fate. It would test whether love freely chosen could stand against the forces that sought to reduce people to property, contracts, and political convenience. Harald the Bloody arrived at midday with 40 armed men, and the arrogance of someone who had never been seriously challenged. His warband spread across the meadow below Ironhold like a dark stain, their shields painted with ravens feeding on corpses, and their spears held ready for immediate use. At their center rode Harald himself, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of old battlefields. Svala watched from the hall's high window as the war leader dismounted near the village gates. Even at this distance, she could see why men feared him. Harald moved with the predatory grace of someone who had survived countless battles through a combination of skill, brutality, and cunning. His byrnie gleamed with oil and care, his weapons showed the patina of frequent use, and his pale hair hung in the intricate braids that marked him as a man who took time with his appearance despite living by violence. He's younger than I expected, she murmured to Einar, who stood beside her in full war gear. Youth makes him more dangerous, not less. Einar's voice carried the calm of a man who had made peace with whatever would come. Old warriors grow cautious because they understand the cost of mistakes. Young ones still believe themselves invincible. The war horn sounded from the gates, not the urgent blast of attack, but the formal call that announced an official parley. Harald had come to claim what he believed was his by right, not to take it by force if he could avoid the expense. But the 40 armed men made clear what would happen if negotiation failed. "Remember," Jarl Thorson said as they prepared to meet the delegation in the Great Hall, "let me handle the formal challenges to the debt contract. Einar will present the alternative arrangement only if Harold rejects the legal arguments." Svala nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. Everything now depended on whether Harold valued political legitimacy more than personal conquest, whether he could be convinced to accept silver instead of subjugation. They arranged themselves in the hall with careful attention to symbolism. Jarl Thorson took his place in the high seat, with Einar standing at his right hand and Svala positioned slightly behind them, close enough to be clearly present, far enough back to suggest she was not the primary participant in what would follow. The shield of trust lay on the table before them, its silver bindings catching the firelight like captured stars. Harold entered without ceremony, flanked by 6 of his most trusted warriors. He wore his war gear into the hall, a calculated insult that suggested he expected violence rather than hospitality. His pale eyes swept the assembled household before fixing on Svala with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "So," he said without preamble, "this is the woman who was promised to settle Runa's debts. She's prettier than I expected, though 3 days of hard riding might change." That, the casual cruelty in his voice, the assumption that her appearance mattered only as it affected his pleasure, crystallized everything Svala had come to understand about the difference between men like Harold and men like Einar. One saw women as objects to be evaluated and used. The other saw them as people worthy of protection and partnership. "Svala Runarsdottir is a guest in my hall," Jarl Thorson replied with icy formality. "She will be treated with the respect due her rank and lineage." Harold laughed, a sound like metal scraping stone. "Respect? She's collateral for a debt her father couldn't pay. The contract is clear. If Runar defaulted, his daughter transfers to my household, along with all property rights. The old man is dead, the debt remains unpaid, and I'm here to collect what's mine." "The debt is disputed," Einar said quietly, stepping forward. "We have reason to believe the original terms were misrepresented, and that Runar was coerced into agreements he wouldn't have made freely." Coerced. Harold's hand moved to his sword hilt. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder of how he typically settled disputes. "The man came to me begging for silver to pay his own creditors. I offered generous terms in exchange for security. If he chose not to tell his daughter the full arrangement, that's hardly my concern." "The terms included clauses hidden from both parties," Jarl Thorson interjected. "Secret provisions that altered the fundamental nature of the agreement, all legal and properly witnessed." Harold pulled out a leather case containing parchments. "I have the contracts here, signed by Runar himself and sealed in the presence of 3 jarls, who can testify to their authenticity." Svala felt her heart sink as she recognized her father's seal on the documents. Harold spread across the table. Whatever arguments they might make about coercion or hidden terms, the law was clear. Properly witnessed contracts were binding, regardless of whether all parties understood every implication. "However," Einar said, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a blade, "the debt can still be satisfied through alternative arrangements." Harold's eyes narrowed with sudden suspicion. This was clearly not the conversation he had expected. "What kind of arrangements?" Einar lifted the shield of trust, its silver bindings gleaming in the firelight. 7 allied jarls have agreed to guarantee Runar's debt in exchange for military alliance. The full amount, 300 marks plus interest, paid in silver rather than settled through marriage. Impossible, but Harold's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "No one commands that much liquid silver without bankrupting themselves. Combined, we do." Einar's smile held no warmth. "And all 7 have more reason to oppose your expansion than to preserve your profit from this particular arrangement." The calculation in Harold's eyes was visible as he weighed silver against political advantage, certain gain against possible conquest. Around him, his warriors shifted nervously. They had come expecting to collect an undefended prize, not to face the combined forces of 8 allied houses. Harold's laugh when he understood the full implications of Einar's offer, carried no humor, only the sharp edge of a man who had been outmaneuvered. "Clever," he admitted, his pale eyes moving between the shield and Einar's face. "But you've made a fundamental miscalculation. Have I?" Einar's voice remained steady, though Svala could see the tension in his shoulders. "You assume I want the silver more than I want the woman." Harold moved closer to the table, his hand still resting on his sword hilt. 300 marks is a fortune, certainly, but control of 2 territories and a wife who comes with legitimate claim to them, that's worth far more than any temporary wealth. Svala felt ice run through her veins as she realized the flaw in their carefully constructed plan. They had assumed Harold was primarily motivated by greed, but his true objective was power, the kind that came from controlling land and people rather than merely accumulating treasure. "The woman has something to say about that," Svala said, stepping forward, despite Einar's subtle gesture for her to remain back. "I am not a prize to be claimed or territory to be conquered." Harold's assessment of her was as thorough as it was insulting. "You are whatever the law says you are, and the law says you belong to whoever can enforce their claim." His smile revealed teeth like yellowed ivory. "I have 40 men outside and legal right on my side. What do you have?" Before anyone could answer, the great doors of the hall swung open. The sound that followed, the measured tread of many feet moving in formation, made every head turn toward the entrance. Through the doorway came a sight that transformed the entire nature of the confrontation. Warriors filled the hall's entrance. Not Harold's raiders, but men bearing the colors and banners of 7 different houses. At their head walked Jarl Magnus the Grey, whose reputation for honor was as legendary as Harold's was for brutality. Behind him came the representatives of every house that had pledged to guarantee Runar's debt. "Harold Bloodaxe," Magnus said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent in leadership. "We understand you have business with our new ally." The calculation in Harold's eyes grew desperate as he counted the armed men now filling the hall. His 40 raiders, formidable against a single household, would be slaughtered by the combined forces now arrayed against him. "This is not your concern." "Magnus," Harold said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "The debt contract is between myself and Runar's heir." "Was between you and Runar," Magnus corrected mildly. "Now it's between you and us. We're prepared to settle the obligation in silver, as Einar proposed." Harold's jaw worked as he struggled with the impossible position he now found himself in. Accepting the silver would solve his immediate financial concerns, but cost him the territorial expansion he really wanted. Refusing would mean declaring war on 8 allied houses, a conflict he could not possibly win. But Harold had not survived to adulthood in the violent world of the northern fjords by accepting defeat gracefully. "The contract specifies the woman herself as compensation. You can't simply substitute silver for what was specifically promised." "Actually," Svala said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "we can." She moved to the table where Harold's contracts lay spread, pointing to a clause she had noticed while the men argued over law and politics. "This provision here, it states that the debt transfers to Runar's heir in the event of his death. But it says nothing about the heir being bound by agreements they didn't make." Every eye in the hall focused on the parchment as Svala traced the relevant text with her finger. "As Runar's daughter and heir, I inherit the debt, but not the specific terms of payment he agreed to. I can choose to honor the obligation through any means that satisfies the amount owed." Harold's face went white with rage as he realized how thoroughly he had been outflanked. The legal ground he had thought solid crumbled beneath his feet, destroyed not by superior force, but by careful reading of his own contracts. "You think word games will save you?" he snarled, his hand moving to draw his sword. "I have the right of combat to settle disputed claims." "Yes," Einar said quietly, his own blade appearing in his hand with smooth efficiency. "You do." The hall filled with the whisper of steel leaving sheaths as warriors on both sides prepared for violence. But Magnus raised one weathered hand and discipline held. "Single combat, then," the old Jarl declared. Harold's champion against the household's champion. Winner takes all, debt settled according to their terms. Harold's smile returned sharp as his blade. I'll stand as my own champion, and I'll stand for mine, Einar replied. Svala felt her world narrow to the space between two men who would fight for the right to determine her future. But as she watched Einar check his sword and shield, she understood that this was no longer about contracts or debts or political arrangements. This was about whether love, freely chosen, could stand against force and brutality, whether patience and honor could triumph over violence and greed. The unity blade, the ceremonial knife used in Norse wedding ceremonies, lay forgotten on the table, as two different concepts of power prepared to test themselves against each other. They fought in the meadow below Ironhold's walls, with the entire village watching from the ramparts and representatives of 8 houses forming a circle around the combat ground. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a cold wind carried the scent of approaching winter. Harold moved like a wolf, quick, vicious, looking for the opening that would end the fight in moments. His swordwork was beautiful in its brutality, each strike calculated to maim or kill rather than simply defeat. He had survived dozens of such combats, and his confidence showed in every aggressive advance. But Einar fought, like his nickname suggested, patient as stone, weathering Harold's attacks while looking for the moment when aggression would overreach itself. His great-grandfather's shield turned aside blow after blow, its silver bindings gleaming each time Harold's blade struck its surface. And slowly, inevitably, Harold began to tire, stand still and die. Harold snarled as another vicious cut failed to penetrate Einar's defense. No, Einar replied calmly, then struck. The blow came from behind his shield, a thrust so quick Harold barely had time to twist aside. Steel scraped across byrny rings, drawing a line of red along Harold's ribs, but not penetrating deeply enough to end the fight. Harold staggered back, pressing his free hand to the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, and for the first time since the combat began, uncertainty flickered in his pale eyes. First blood to Einar Thorson. Magnus called from the circle's edge. "Do you yield, Harold?" "Never," but Harold's voice carried less conviction now. He circled warily, looking for an opening that would let him land a decisive blow before blood loss weakened him further. It came when Einar appeared to stumble on a hidden stone. Harold lunged forward with everything he had left, his sword aimed at the gap between helmet and byrny where it would slide cleanly into the neck. But the stumble had been feigned. As Harold committed to his attack, Einar pivoted on his planted foot and brought his own blade up in an arc that caught Harold's sword near the hilt. The impact sent Harold's weapon spinning away across the grass, leaving him defenseless and off balance. Einar's sword point came to rest against Harold's throat, just above the bronze collar that protected his neck. One thrust would end the fight permanently. "Yield," Einar said quietly. Harold's eyes blazed with fury and humiliation, but he could feel steel pricking his skin with each breath. Around the circle, his own warriors watched their leader's defeat with expressions that ranged from shock to calculation, already wondering whether their loyalty lay with a man who could no longer protect them. "I yield," Harold said through gritted teeth. Einar stepped back, lowering his sword. "The debt is settled through the terms we offered. 300 marks in silver, paid by the allied houses in exchange for military alliance. Svala Runarsdottir is free to choose her own path." Harold climbed to his feet, his hands still pressed to the bleeding wound along his ribs. He looked around the circle at the watching faces, his own men, the allied warriors, the villagers who had witnessed his defeat. When his gaze finally settled on Svala, she saw something she had not expected, a grudging respect. "You fought well for her," he said to Einar. "Perhaps she was worth the price after all." "She was never yours to price," Einar replied simply. Harold retrieved his sword and walked toward his waiting horse, his warriors falling in behind him. At the edge of the meadow, he turned back for one final look at the woman who had cost him so much. "This isn't finished," he called, though the words carried more resignation than threat. Yes, Svala said, stepping forward so her voice would carry clearly across the distance between them. It is. 3 days later, the great cauldron finally served its intended purpose, but not for the wedding everyone had originally expected. Instead, it held the feast that celebrated a different kind of union, the alliance between 8 houses united against territorial aggression, sealed by representatives who had witnessed honor triumph over brutality. Svala and Einar stood before the assembled guests not as parties to an arranged marriage, but as 2 people who had chosen each other through circumstances neither had anticipated. Magnus the Grey performed the ceremony, using words that spoke of partnership rather than possession, choice rather than obligation. When Einar lifted the unity blade to make the ritual cuts on their palms, joining their blood as symbol of their joined lives, Svala felt the last doubt dissolve. This was not the marriage her father had arranged, or the choice she had thought she was making during her journey over the mountains. This was something entirely new, a union forged in the crucible of external pressure but refined by mutual respect and freely given love. "The tapestry is finished," Astrid commented later, as the celebration continued around them. She gestured toward the great loom, where Svala's weaving now showed 2 figures joined not by a single dramatic bridge, but by countless small threads that had gradually closed the gap between them. "No," Svala said, studying her work with new eyes. "It's just beginning." The new family crest they would carry bore symbols from both their histories: the climbing woman from Svala's mountain crossing, the patient man from Einar's vigil, and between them a representation of the runestone that had taught them about freely chosen paths. But surrounding these central figures were empty spaces, waiting for the stories they would write together. Winter came early that year, but Ironhold's halls remained warm with the presence of allies who had learned that some things were worth defending against those who would take them by force. And in the weaving hall, a new tapestry began to take shape, one that would tell the story of how love freely chosen could stand against any storm, as long as both people were willing to fight for the right to choose each other again and again. The promised bride had indeed come late to her feast. But as Einar had told her in those first crucial moments, she had arrived exactly when she was meant to, just in time to discover what it meant to be truly free.